My aunt told everyone I was selfish for not taking care of my elderly grandmother, but when I found out she had been stealing from her, I made sure she got what she deserved. You won't believe what I found out about my aunt. For weeks, she'd been spreading rumors about me, calling me selfish, because I wasn't doing enough to take care of my elderly grandmother. The guilt trip she laid on me was unbearable, especially since I was already trying to balance my own life, work, and responsibilities. But the truth was, I knew something didn't feel right about her. There was just something off about the way she'd always push me to do more for Grandma, almost like she was trying to get me to take over all her care. Then, one day, everything changed. I was visiting Grandma's house, helping her sort through some old boxes, when I found a series of suspiciously large withdrawals from her bank account. These weren't just little purchases, some of them were pretty significant sums of money. But what really struck me was that they all happened when my aunt was the one looking after her. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. So, I decided to dig a little deeper. That's when I found evidence that my aunt had been stealing from Grandma for months. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Not only had she been taking money, but she had been manipulating my grandmother, convincing her to sign checks and make gifts under false pretenses. My mind was racing as I pieced everything together. My aunt's accusations of me being selfish suddenly felt like a cover-up, a way to distract everyone from her own wrongdoing. But what was I supposed to do now? Should I confront her directly? Or was there a more calculated way to make sure she faced the consequences for what she'd done? I knew I had to protect my grandmother, but I also knew this wouldn't be easy. What followed was a series of decisions that would change everything. But what happened next? Well, that's where the story takes a twist. Stay tuned for what I did next. At first, I wasn't sure how to approach the situation. I felt like I was walking on eggshells. If I accused my aunt of stealing, it would tear the family apart. She was always the helpful one, the one everyone turned to for advice. She would show up at family gatherings, always with a story about how much she was doing for Grandma. In the beginning, I didn't want to believe she could be capable of something like this. But as I started putting the pieces together, everything started to make sense. I remembered the times I'd visited Grandma, and my aunt would be there, hovering over her, always looking over her shoulder when I tried to have a conversation. I had noticed how her behavior would change when she was around. She would get all sweet and caring, but it never felt genuine. It was like she was trying to control the situation, make sure Grandma only trusted her. There were even times when Grandma would mention how tired she was, how she didn't have enough energy to do things she used to enjoy. But when I would suggest we call someone to help, my aunt would swoop in and take over, insisting she had everything under control. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my aunt wasn't just taking advantage of my grandmother's declining health, she was manipulating her. I remembered the way Grandma's bank statements had always seemed in order before my aunt started helping her out. But now, there were all these strange charges for things Grandma had no recollection of buying. The withdrawals were mostly in cash, and every time I tried to ask about them, my aunt would quickly change the subject or claim Grandma had taken out money for some emergency she couldn't explain. It didn't take long before I started noticing that Grandma's savings were dwindling faster than they should have been. I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was clear something was going on behind the scenes. But how could I confront my aunt without risking everything? My family trusted her, and the last thing I wanted was to start a war. I needed proof, concrete evidence that would leave no room for denial. I started keeping a closer eye on things, taking note of what I saw during my visits. But I knew I couldn't do it alone. That's when I decided to reach out to someone outside the family, a private investigator. I couldn't believe I was going this far, but I needed answers. What if the truth was worse than I imagined? What if my aunt wasn't just stealing, but had been doing something far more sinister? Hiring the private investigator was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made. I kept second-guessing myself. What if I was overreacting? What if my aunt really was just helping Grandma and I was misjudging her? But I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. I needed to know for sure what was going on. The investigator was discreet, and we agreed on a plan. He'd start by monitoring Grandma's bank activity, and I'd continue visiting as usual, keeping an eye on my aunt without letting her know anything was off. The first few days felt like an eternity. I barely slept, constantly thinking about what I might uncover. The investigator kept me updated, and each report made my stomach churn. Small, but significant, patterns were emerging, more unexplained withdrawals, large cash deposits that couldn't be traced, and transactions that seemed out of place. But there was something else that was bothering me. The way my aunt's behavior was becoming even more controlling. When I'd visit, she'd make a point to be there, hovering over every little thing I did. At times, it felt like she was trying to distance me from Grandma, subtly undermining any attempts I made to take care of her. I couldn't help but feel trapped. The more I dug, the more I realized that confronting my aunt could be dangerous. If I accused her, it might escalate into something far worse, and my family could turn against me. I had to be careful, especially with Grandma's fragile health. I didn't want her to feel caught in the middle, but at the same time, I had to protect her from whatever my aunt was doing. It became clear that this wasn't just about money. I found out that my aunt had been slowly taking control of Grandma's life in other ways too. She'd been changing things around the house, moving things into her own name, and even pushing Grandma to sign paperwork she didn't fully understand. When I confronted Grandma about it, she seemed confused, almost like she wasn't aware of the extent of what had been happening. I could tell something wasn't right, but she was always so trusting of my aunt, and I didn't want to make her feel paranoid. The investigator managed to get his hands on a recording of a conversation between my aunt and another person. In it, she was talking about her plans to take what's rightfully hers once Grandma was no longer able to manage her finances. That moment hit me like a ton of bricks. My aunt wasn't just exploiting Grandma's vulnerability, she was planning for something even worse. The stakes were higher than I had imagined. But I wasn't sure what to do next. I had the evidence now, but I had to tread carefully. If I confronted my aunt with what I knew, it could ruin everything. The only thing I knew for sure was that I couldn't let her get away with it. But the deeper I went into this mess, the more I realized this was only the beginning. I needed a plan, and I had to think it through, before it was too late. The more I found out, the more my anxiety grew. Every time I visited Grandma, I had to pretend everything was normal. My aunt was always there, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I started feeling like I was playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse, but the stakes were so high. If I didn't act soon, I could lose my chance to stop her before things got even worse. One evening, after an especially tense visit where my aunt had been unusually possessive of Grandma, I received a call from the investigator. The news he shared made my heart race. He had found out that my aunt was planning to take a large sum of money from Grandma's account the very next day. It was the final step in her scheme, a direct transfer of money that would wipe out most of Grandma's savings. My aunt had arranged it under the guise of paying for medical bills that she said Grandma owed, but it was all a lie. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. This was it, the tipping point. If I didn't do something now, my aunt would get away with it, and Grandma would lose everything. I felt the weight of the decision bearing down on me. I had to act quickly, but how? Confronting my aunt directly could trigger a meltdown, and I wasn't sure if I could handle the fallout. Not to mention, I had no idea how she'd react when she realized I knew everything. I couldn't just go in guns blazing, I had to be strategic. But what if she had already thought of that? What if she had a way to cover her tracks and leave me with no proof? The thought of losing the fight before I even got the chance to act sent a chill down my spine. That night, I barely slept. Every scenario I played out in my head seemed more dangerous than the last. But the next morning, as I prepared to go to Grandma's, a sense of urgency hit me. This wasn't just about money anymore, it was about protecting her from someone she trusted, someone who had been so close to her for years. I had to make sure Grandma knew the truth before it was too late. As I walked into Grandma's house, my aunt was there as usual, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee. She greeted me with a forced smile, but I could see the tension in her eyes. It was almost as if she knew I was getting closer to uncovering everything. I tried to keep my calm, to act like nothing had changed. But inside, my heart was pounding. I couldn't waste any more time. The game had changed, and it was time for me to make my move. I sat down at the kitchen table, trying to act casual, but every fiber of my being was on high alert. My aunt was watching me, almost as if she could sense I knew something was off. I knew I had to be careful, but the urgency was becoming overwhelming. The private investigator had given me everything I needed: bank statements, recordings, and even proof of the upcoming transfer. All I had to do now was confront my aunt and expose everything, but I needed to do it at the right moment. As I sipped my coffee, trying to steady my nerves, my aunt suddenly broke the silence. "You seem a little off today," she said with a sly grin. "Is everything okay?" Her voice was sweet, too sweet, and it sent a chill through me. Was she trying to throw me off, or did she already know that I knew? The doubt crept in, but I pushed it aside. I had to stay focused. "Yeah, I'm fine," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just a little tired." I had to be careful not to give anything away, but inside, my mind was racing. I needed to figure out how to bring this all to light without tipping her off. But then, just as I was about to say something, my phone buzzed with a new notification. It was from the investigator. My heart sank as I read the message: "The transfer has already been made. You need to act fast." My stomach dropped. How could she have done it so quickly? I hadn't even had the chance to stop her. Panic began to settle in, and I felt the weight of the situation pressing on me harder than ever. My aunt had moved faster than I anticipated. She'd outsmarted me at my own game. What had seemed like a simple confrontation was now spiraling into something far more dangerous. I glanced at my phone again. There it was, the confirmation of the transfer. A significant amount of money had been moved from Grandma's account into a separate one that my aunt had set up months ago. It was all happening right in front of me. The betrayal was worse than I had ever imagined. But even worse, my aunt now had a clear path to cover her tracks. If I didn't act fast, I'd lose everything. Just as I was about to leave to confront her, my aunt made a sudden, unsettling move. "Before you go," she said, standing up from the table, "I think we need to have a little chat about what you've been snooping around." Her voice was colder now, the sweetness gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. My blood ran cold. She knew. She knew everything. For a split second, my mind raced. How had she found out? Was it the investigator's report? Or had she suspected me all along? The tension in the room was unbearable. I could feel the walls closing in, and every part of me screamed that this was it, that I was finally about to see the full extent of her manipulation. My aunt wasn't just a thief. She was a master of deception, and now I was the one in the hot seat. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The stakes had just escalated to a level I hadn't prepared for. My aunt wasn't just the manipulator I thought she was playing a much more dangerous game. And now, I had to find a way to turn the tables, before she turned them on me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as my aunt's words hung in the air. I had no idea how she knew, but I couldn't back down now. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound calm, even though my mind was in chaos. My aunt smiled, her eyes glinting with an unsettling sense of superiority. "You really think you're the only one who knows what's been going on here?" she asked, her voice dropping to a low, almost mocking tone. "You've been digging, haven't you? Playing detective." I tried to keep my composure, but it was clear that she was toying with me. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing one wrong move could send everything crashing down. "Look, Aunt, I know what you've been doing. The money, the withdrawals, the manipulation. It's all there," I said, hoping that confronting her directly would force her to finally admit it. But she just laughed softly, shaking her head as if I were an amusing child. You think you've uncovered everything? You're a little late, don't you think? The pit in my stomach grew deeper. What did she mean? Was there more? I felt a wave of panic surge through me, but I refused to let it show. I had already made it this far. I couldn't back down now. It's not just the money, Aunt, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. It's the way you've been manipulating Grandma. You've been controlling her, taking everything she's worked for. For a moment, she seemed almost contemplative, like she was weighing something in her mind. Then, she spoke again, her tone cold and calculating. You have no idea what you're dealing with, do you? Before I could respond, the doorbell rang. My aunt's expression faltered for a split second, just enough for me to notice. It wasn't the usual delivery guy or someone from the neighborhood. I didn't know who it was, but I knew something was off. I turned to my aunt, who quickly moved toward the door, her face tightening in an unusual way. I followed her instinctively, and as the door opened, a man in a suit stepped inside, holding a briefcase. His face was unfamiliar, but the moment I saw him, I knew something wasn't right. He looked at me for a moment before turning his gaze to my aunt. Without a word, she led him into the living room, her posture suddenly stiff, as if the relaxed, manipulative aunt I'd known was gone. I hesitated for a moment, confusion swirling in my mind. Something felt wrong, something I wasn't understanding. But the truth hit me like a ton of bricks when the man spoke. We've been waiting for this. It's time to finalize everything. I froze. My aunt had been playing a much deeper game than I realized. She wasn't just stealing money from Grandma, she had orchestrated an entire financial scheme. This man was part of a larger operation, one that involved more than just her own greed. She had been setting up a complex financial arrangement that had now entangled multiple people. I had underestimated how far she was willing to go to keep her control. I stepped forward, unable to hide my shock. What is this? Who are you? The man looked at me with a cold smile. Your aunt has been very resourceful. You've been playing catch up, but she's always been several steps ahead. You're too late. I turned to my aunt, my mind reeling. She had planned all of this, the transfers, the manipulation, the scheme to take control of Grandma's wealth. But there was one thing she hadn't planned for, my persistence. In the end, the investigator had one last piece of crucial evidence. He had traced the man's identity, and the truth came out. He wasn't just an accomplice, he was a lawyer, and my aunt had been attempting to manipulate legal documents to leave herself everything, including Grandma's estate. When I confronted her with this final twist, her mask of control cracked. She thought she had outsmarted me, but I had played my final card. The authorities were contacted, and my aunt's entire operation unraveled. Grandma was saved from losing everything she had worked for, and I realized that sometimes, doing the right thing meant taking risks, no matter how dangerous they seemed. But the last thing I'll never forget is the look in my aunt's eyes as she was led away. She didn't just lose control of the situation. She lost everything she thought she had gained. And me? I learned that sometimes the greatest victory comes from simply standing your ground, no matter the odds. The aftermath of everything that had unfolded was a blur. My aunt's arrest was all over the news, and the family was left reeling from the shock. It was hard to believe that the woman I'd grown up trusting, the one who had always been there, could have done something so manipulative and deceitful. But as the truth came out, the more I realized how much I had underestimated her. She had been playing a dangerous game, and the stakes were much higher than I had ever imagined. Grandma, thankfully, was safe. She didn't fully understand everything that had happened, and I didn't want to burden her with the details of the scandal. I just kept reassuring her that everything was going to be okay. Slowly, I helped her regain her confidence, and together, we made sure her finances were secure. It was heartbreaking to see how much my aunt had been able to manipulate her, but I was grateful that we had caught it in time. The whole ordeal made me think about trust, about how easily it can be broken by those closest to us. My aunt had made everyone believe she was the one who cared most about Grandma, but in reality, she had only been looking out for herself. I had learned, sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones that leave the deepest scars. After all the legal battles and the chaos, life started to find its rhythm again. Grandma and I would spend afternoons together, talking about everything and nothing. It was bittersweet, knowing what could have happened, but I was relieved that we had made it through. The experience changed me in ways I never expected. It showed me the power of persistence, of not backing down when you know something isn't right, even when it seems easier to let it slide. I learned that family isn't just about loyalty, but about respect, honesty, and being there for each other, no matter what. Looking back, I realize I would never have been able to do it without the help of the investigator, and without my own determination to protect my grandmother. The truth always has a way of coming to light, no matter how much someone tries to hide it. And while I'll never forget the pain of what my aunt did, I also know it's something that will make me even more vigilant in the future. Life goes on, but some lessons stick with you forever.